he wasn't offering to pay me. And mind you, if he did, I would have even been more offended. But he was offering to write the story for me and then have me like look it over. How unethical. I mean, I had to question everything. I assume, again, he was probably pretty young, but I mean, do 25-year-olds not know that you don't do that to the New York Times?
This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Briley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Apkin, co-founder of Collective.
Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent watch brands, including Gaga Laboratorio. That's right. Gaga Laboratorio is the latest brand to join our shop, and we are thrilled to have them. This is a really cool brand. We actually first met them at Watches and Wonders this year, just about a month and a half ago. And we'd been turned on to them last year. They have really cool idiosyncratic watches. They're quintessentially Italian in their design. They make absolutely beautiful, classically design-driven watches with some unusual time-telling layouts. The brand is based in Italy. The watches are made in Switzerland, and they're designed by a gentleman named Mo Capoletta, who some of you may know, who's a legendary tattoo artist and graphic designer. He's based in London, and he's the artistic director for the brand, and he's done some amazing projects in the world of watches with Bulgari, most notably, and now he's joined the folks at Gaga as the creative director of Gaga Laboratorio, and it's impossible to describe these watches in a podcast open. So go to collectivehorology.com and check these things out. They're just beautiful and really cool. And Asher, speaking of beautiful and cool things, we've got one more thing to plug.
We are coming up really fast on our second edition of Open House. Open House, for those of you who are listeners of the pod or who came last year, is our big event that we do annually here in Los Angeles, giving independent watch lovers and collectors the opportunity to go hands-on with a wide range of brands. And this year, we are even bigger than we were last year. We've got the full line and representatives coming in from Chapac, from Garrick, from Ming, Sartori Biard, Singer, Speak Marine, Standard H, and a new and final edition, a watch company that we have had our eye on for some time and whose watches and clocks we've always admired and wanted to bring into the United States. Our friends from Carl Sushi & Son will also be present. The event takes place from noon until 6 p.m. on Saturday, June 7th in Hollywood, California. The event is completely free. All you have to do is register, and to do so, you can go to collectivehorology.com/openhouse to RSVP, or visit our website, navigate to the top of the page, click events, and you'll find Open House there, as well as any other future events that we're running. So we'd love to see you there. And if you have any questions about the event, or if there's anything that we can provide additionally, you can always shoot us an email or a message.
We may need to change the strap line for this event, because the strap line is "Go hands-on with independent watches." We may need to change it to "Go hands-on with independent watches and clocks."
Go independent with hands.
Don't do that. I'm gonna update everything now. Although I don't know if you can actually go hands-on with the clock, but it will be there from what I'm told, which is cool. All right, let's talk about editorial independence in the watch world. This has always been a hot topic. We've talked about it on the podcast before, most notably maybe a year ago with our friend Stephen Pulverant. And I think back in October, there was sort of this shot across the bow, and that came from our guest today. She penned a letter. It was an open letter to the watch industry, and it was published in Robb Report, and it was entitled, "Watch Execs Need to Learn to Respect Journalistic Boundaries." And I think for a lot of us in the industry, this really sort of, not in a bad way, but touched a nerve. She put her finger on what has long been and is becoming a real challenge for people who are writing about and ultimately consuming content about watches. Our guest today is Victoria Gomelsky. She is the editor-in-chief of JCK, a New York City-based jewelry trade publication founded in 1869. Her writing on watches, jewelry, and travel has appeared in the New York Times, Robb Report, Wall Street Journal Magazine, and The Hollywood Reporter, among others. And today we're going to talk with her about that open letter and more broadly, journalistic independence and integrity in watch media. So Victoria, welcome to Open Work.
Thanks so much, Gabe. Thanks, Asher. It's such a pleasure and honor to be here.
Well, we are happy to have you. And your article, as Gabe pointed out, was something that we'll link to it in the show notes, so everyone should have a chance to read it. But was something that we read and immediately started talking about. And I think I even picked up the phone and called you about it because I found it to be such an unusual, and I think we'll talk about why, but such an unusual bit of brutal honesty in an industry that doesn't always welcome that kind of honesty. So you've been working in the luxury industry for decades. So why did you choose to publish this now?
It kind of came up because I had just started writing a column for Robb Report. They do these perhaps a newsletter is a better term. They started publishing these newsletters that go out to their subscribers if you sign up for them. And they wanted me to pen the weekly watch column called In the Loop. And at the time, my editor, who you may know, Alan Farmello, he's not with Robb anymore, but he was there. And as we were talking about topics for this watch column, he really was urging me to do something first person. And I was super resistant because I've always been the reporter. I've always been the person who calls up people, asks them, to spend an hour on the phone with me talking about this or that. I'll take parts of that conversation, add it to other conversations I've gotten, and then come up with a story. I'm certainly not a critic. I've never been an on the wrist reviewer. I just never really found a way to sort of implicate myself in my own stories. And so I resisted. And finally, I'd gotten an email and it really irked me from somebody who was pitching me. And I thought, all right, well, I'm just going to write about how annoying this is for me, this email and kind of what it opened up, or this can of worms that it sort of led to. And the email came from this, I won't name him or the company, but it was this pre-owned watch platform, some sort of new entrepreneur in the space. I take it he was pretty young. I think he was based in New York, and he opened by asking me to collaborate with him, which is a term I get in a lot of different emails from PR people. And it always just makes my skin crawl, this idea of collaboration, because sure, that's a topic we cover quite a bit in the watch world, collaborations between brands, artists, retailers, all kinds of different collab projects. But journalists, or at least the kind of writer I am, I don't collaborate. I don't co-create things with my sources. I don't ask them to review my copy and say, is this okay with you? And so that collaborate just isn't the word I would use for what I do.
So let's dig into that a little bit, because I think we've had a couple of different perspectives around approaches to content creation, and I want to separate that out from journalism, because obviously those are not the same thing, or maybe not obviously, but those are not the same things.
They're not.
And putting aside this young gentleman and his approach to you, can you just, for the sake of clarity, explain the difference between and let's use me as an example. If Collective were to approach a very talented content creator, like say Adrian Barker, versus us pitching you on a story, from your perspective, can you set the guardrails for what's different than working with a creator like Bark and Jack?
I mean, I think when you collaborate on something, your intent is to sell or promote a product, at heart. I mean, I think the difference is that I'm not your marketing sort of team. I'm not part of your PR team. That's not my role. My role is to interview you, to find out what's new, to report that to an audience of people who are interested in what you're doing and may buy what you're doing. But I'm not there to be an extension of your PR, which is, I think, where a lot of this gets very confused. I think a lot of people assume that I am, and that they can have their sort of free reign over what I write, because of course I'm just there to promote them. I'm there in service of the readership. I'm there to tell them, again, I'm not a critic though, so I'm not sitting here saying this is a good or a bad watch. I'm just reporting this is a new collection. This is where it falls in the context of collections that have come before it. This is what it means business-wise. This is why trend-wise this is new or different. I mean, I'm there to put it in context for people and help them make their own decisions about what that means for them. But I'm certainly not there to critique the watch or to help sell it, even though that may be what happens as a result of my piece. Maybe I do help sell it because people are intrigued enough to go buy it. But I could care less, I could care less if it sells well.
Why do you
Which
think
is,
that? So, but this is interesting to me. Like, why do you think that idea exists, right? I mean, if I look at a completely different part of the journalistic world, right? If I decide I'm going to run for office and I call up the New York Times or the LA Times or something, the idea of saying, "Hey, I'd like to collaborate with you on my election" is such a ridiculous thing to imagine. So I'm just curious, like, why do you think, or is there a moment that pivoted or changed? Or, I mean, you wrote this letter which implied that there's been an uptick in this. That's how I read it, at least, so that you see this enough or commonly enough that it was worth drawing attention to. So was there an inflection point, or has it always been this way?
Well, it hasn't always been this way. So, I mean, I should back up and say I started writing about watches in the year 2000, which makes me feel like a dinosaur. It certainly was a different time in the watch world, a different time in media. I started writing for a trade magazine. I didn't know anything about watches, but I was hired it was a B2B trade publication. I was hired, actually, it was a B2B website, Web 1.0. And I was hired to be their Pearl and Watch editor. It was a site for retailers who were sourcing inventory online, and which was in and of itself a kind of a fantastical concept. I mean, they barely do that today, much less the year 2000. And they had an editorial site sort of complementing the real business model of the website, and they wanted to report on things in the industry. So they hired me. And I knew nothing about watches, but I started going to Baselworld and started interviewing executives and started, seeing what was coming out and reporting on all that. And for a long time, there wasn't a lot of, it was pretty straightforward. I was doing my very best to be a journalist. I mean, I never felt like an investigative journalist, and there's tiers of journalists. I wasn't doing the most serious work. You realize when you're writing about watches, you're not writing about, warfare or pharmaceuticals or things that are actually life and death. So there was automatically a sort of, kind of less gravitas maybe to what I was covering than what maybe what a journalist conjures in most people's minds. But I still did my best to do honest reporting, to write fairly and objectively without inserting or editorializing what I was creating. And then maybe around 2007 or 8, the company I worked for, which was a big trade show company that happened to own a lot of trade show titles, trade magazine titles. They owned Hollywood Reporter at the time. They owned Billboard. They owned Frozen Food News. I mean, really tons of different, categories. And they happened to own National Jeweler, which was the magazine I was writing for. And they did this sort of like informational session on blogs. And I remember thinking, what the heck is a blog? And it was a web blog, right? And that was that first sign. Maybe this was actually closer to like 2007, that there was a new form of media that was kind of coming up, and it was a different approach. And I think we all kind of left that meeting a little mystified. Like, what on earth is this? Should I be doing this? I never did, by the way. I never did start my own blog, but 2008 is when Hodinkee started. And so this was an inflection point, really. That was when this idea of journalism was kind of superseded by this idea of content. Suddenly we were content creators. We were no longer, I mean, the idea of watch journalism, I think maybe just the term itself is almost an anachronism, or I'm an anachronism when I talk about it, because I think most of what we see out in the world that covers the watch world and the watch industry is actually content and not so much journal. It's different forms of content and different shades of it. And some is more polemic and, or polemical and kind of critical and kind of diatribes, and others are just fawning product reviews of people who've gotten a chance to test drive their favorite watches. A lot of it is written by collectors or people who came to watches through their enthusiasm for the product. Versus me, like, I'm not a collector at all. I come to really, admire watchmakers and like watches and have a few of my own. But I don't come to it from this like passionate pursuit that I then figured out a way to make my career, which is I think a lot of what you find when you go to Geneva for Watches and Wonders, or when you a little less so Basel World, because that was still back a little bit in the days when, I mean, I guess your earliest content creators probably did start at Basel, like Watch a Niche. Are you familiar with
Sure.
Watch a Niche? Yeah. So guys like that kind of came up around 2011, 2012 when Instagram was born, essentially. But, you know, a lot of people come to this from a much different angle than I did. I came up as somebody who had, and by the way, I hope this doesn't sound arrogant at all. I don't mean to be like there's some truer or purer form of watch writing that exists. I mean, I admire people who know and, you know, kind of get deep into the mechanics of a piece and can talk at length about, you know, escapements and all the other bits and pieces of a watch. I cannot. So there's just different ways to exist in this world as somebody who covers the world of watches. And I just come at it from a different perspective because I never came at it from like a collector enthusiast point of view. I came at it, I mean, I was like a daily Bruin reporter at UCLA, and that's where I learned how to be a reporter. And it was so basic, you know, but I still try to adhere to those kinds of standards, the ones you learned. I never went to J school. I did go to Columbia for School of the Arts, but I did nonfiction writing at Columbia. So not J school per se, but enough of a sense of like, this is how old school journalists do it. They call people up, they have interviews, they, you know, take all those notes together, they do their reporting, and then they come out with something that feels honest and objective.
Yeah, I think, you know, this is an important point worth underscoring and just having terms, right? I think that, Asher, you mentioned this, like the word watch journalism and content and media, you know, these things are just often thrown in a blender and used interchangeably, but there are some important differences. Journalism, Victoria, like you're pointing out here, it's a practice. You know, there are journalistic standards. There are schools for journalism. If you ask, and you write for the New York Times, if you ask the New York Times to produce their standards and their practices, they would. They can tell you, you know, how, I don't know what the answers to these things are, but they could tell you, you know, how you need to confirm information and how many sources you need to report something. And there are very clear standards. Now, there are trade-offs there, right? So, to your point, you probably can't write about, you know, the differences in different kinds of escapements or even a spring bar to the way someone like Jack Forster who could
right,
who works for the 1916 company, which is a retailer. So just because he works for a retailer doesn't mean his knowledge is somehow, you know, doesn't have value. It does. But I think of, you know, this umbrella of watch media. There's all sorts of watch media out there. I think the lane you're in and what you practice is a form of journalism. So you're reporting on watches as a journalist. And that's very different from what other watch media do, whether that's Hodinkee or Fratello or SJX or you know, publications like that. By the way, those all have relationships themselves with retailers. You know, that's a different sort of practice. Then there's different practices with people who are individual creators, whether it's someone like Adrian Barker or even someone who's just a collector and is writing passionately about something. They're going to write with a level of passion and, frankly, oftentimes a lack of bias that can be really refreshing. You know, when a collector writes a review about a watch, maybe it's on Watch Crunch or something like that. But you also have to be aware, like, they may not be well researched. So I view watch media as the umbrella, and within watch media, there's all sorts of different practices, from content creation to enthusiast media to journalism. And I think Asher asked this question of like, well, why are you, Victoria, a journalist, seeing this problem more and more and more? And I would actually lay that at the feet of watch content creators and watch enthusiast media who are oftentimes pay to play. And if I'm going to give the guy, I'm assuming it's a guy, I'm going to give the person at this pre-owned watch platform or whatever it was, the benefit of the doubt here. And when he approached you, I would guess that this person also approached some enthusiast media. Let's say, I'm making this up, but let's say he reached out to Fratello or Worn and Wound.
Sure.
And maybe he reached out to someone who's on YouTube who creates content as well and wanted to collaborate with them. And in that context, collaboration makes sense. Maybe they're being compensated in some way for what they're doing. And there are just different rules of engagement, or sometimes lack of rules of engagement in that space. And then he approaches you. Why would it be any different? So I wonder if, to some extent, watch media, not necessarily watch journalism, but watch media, has created this problem and this perception that everything is kind of open for collaboration.
I mean, for sure. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think the thing that, and I didn't complete the story of what this guy's email or his pitch, the reason it really bothered me, it wasn't because he used the word collaborate. I mean, I get that so often. I need to.
Oh, I remember. It got even worse, didn't it? Go on. It gets darker.
In fact, I'm going to just quote I'll pull up the piece and I'll quote the line that really made my jaw hit the floor. And he said, "Please let me know if this is something you'd be interested in," he wrote in closing. "I could take a first pass at a draft." So this guy actually thought, I mean, it's mind-boggling because, again, he knew he was writing to me at the New York Times. I mean, maybe if you're reaching out to some kind of starter blog, maybe you think that would help, the person you're pitching. But if you read the New York Times, and you made that point earlier, if you're like writing on an election or reporting on something happening in the world of, policing or whatever, and you offer to write a draft for the New York Times, I mean, that would never happen. What nonsense. I'm incredulous that he could think that we write for the same publication, but I would still accept or somehow be happy that he'd offered me a draft. He wasn't offering to pay me. And mind you, if he did, I would have even been more offended. But he was offering to write the story for me and then have me look it over. It's just how ignorant, how unethical. I mean, I had to question everything. I assume, again, he was probably pretty young, but I mean, do 25-year-olds not know that you don't do that to the New York Times? Do they not know that?
I you know what? I don't know. And as you say this, I'm reminded of a couple of conversations from former careers. One was at Facebook, where I remember there was a period where I guess content creators and influencers were becoming more and more pervasive. And the FTC was really kind of flexing a little bit there and saying, you guys need to be a lot clearer in your guidelines when somebody's being paid to say something versus when they aren't, because what an advertisement is a legally defined thing, and it is to many degrees regulated. So you have to make sure somebody knows. I'm forgetting the exact language, but there is specific language from the FTC that a reasonable person would know that what they are seeing is a commercial message. Now, how that's interpreted varies dramatically, publication to publication, platform to platform, but the standard is that a reasonable person would be able to discern that. The problem around that came up in that space was that makes sense if I'm a media platform and the person approaching me is asking me to do something for them because I'm a business and I work for a business or am of a business, and I can metabolize guidelines like that. If I'm just a person who is now receiving money to talk about something that I'm into, whether it's a beauty product or a watch or a book or whatever, that's a little blurry because somebody's just like, oh, it's a cottage industry, like FTC guidelines. What's the FTC? Isn't that the same as the FCC? And it's like all this stuff that goes back and forth. So I do wonder if you grew up in that era. So in other words, if you're a child, of the last 15 years of adolescence into adulthood, maybe you don't know that that's a weird thing to say. And I'm not defending it, by the way, but I'm not sure that stands. The problem there, of course, is that when we look at this in this context, it's like, how do you then untangle that? And how do you, and I guess this is a rhetorical question, but I'm curious your point of view. Like, how do you, as a proper journalist, wave that flag so that someone knows when they're reading a piece from you or from JCK or New York Times or what have you, that is a objectively created piece of content, not a blurred line product. Like, what do you do?
The New York Times to me is how I do that. I don't know. To your point, maybe
the New York Times is the flag.
It's my flag, and then I guess over 25 years of writing about watches, I hope that I've built enough credibility, and that if people know my byline, maybe they don't, but if they care to dive in and look at some of my past articles, they just get a sense of this, and they go to the Times and they see what I've written. I mean, it's always, I try to interview at least 10 people per story. I often will spend an hour. Not everybody's available for a phone or video call, but 8 out of 10 interviews really need to be on the phone or via video. Email responses are just crap generally because, again, people wordsmith, people write like press releases, and it's just not helpful. I like to hear people's voices. I like to hear them, sort of struggling to find their words. I like to hear the ums and the ahs because it's just real and it's authentic. And so, occasionally I'll include an emailed quote, but for the most part, I try to get people on the phone. This is how I do it. I think for a lot of watch writing, you'll find there's not a single quote in there. It's just people's opining, opining about whatever they think, but it's not journalism.
Well, you're making me think about the interesting position you sit in, because there's not a lot of reporters out there that are looking at the industry as opposed to its product. And obviously, like, the two are clearly related, but there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in the way that the industry is run. And you've certainly done some coverage of the realities that CEOs in the space face, that the market faces, et cetera. In the context of business conversations, not product releases, have you ever run into these kinds of requests before? Like, if a company is challenged, are they like, can we collaborate with you on explaining why our business is not challenged?
No, never that blatant, but I will almost always get requests from the PR teams asking, certainly for questions in advance, which, I'll often grant because, like, you sent me questions in advance. It just helps you organize your own thoughts. It helps me organize what I'm after. So I get the request for questions in advance all the time. I also, in an uncomfortable fashion, always get requests for, can we review the quotes? Can we see the story? And it stuns me. It always stuns me because, honestly, if I let people review their stories, I think one or a handful of times I've sent them their direct quotes and said, here's the direct quote. I never send like paraphrases. I never send stories, but I'll sometimes send a direct quote because some people are so insistent and I just want to get them off my back. But they always end up wordsmithing it. And I'm like, I recorded that thing. This is what you said. Yeah. You get into this battle where you're like, I'm not your press person. You don't get to wordsmith these things after the fact all the time. I think people often, again, back to, they think I'm there to serve them. Like, they think my purpose is to further their marketing needs. Often they'll come out and blatantly say that this would be a great platform for us to share our new product.
I bet it would.
Yes, of course it would. Duh. But
well, you're also bringing up a point which I think is fascinating, right? Which is something that I think often gets lost, which is, let's assume for a moment best intent on all sides, right? And if you have a large corporation and their media team is there, that's that person's job to try and protect the company. And it's obviously that representative who's being interviewed by you, it's their job to put forward as good a face as they can, even if what's coming out of their mouth is like milk toast, whatever. But what is interesting to me about that is, in order for a platform arguably to have credibility, then it can't always just report the point of view of that third party. So ironically, by forcing tell me if you think I'm stepping outside the line, but by forcing an outlet to, like, quote unquote represent, the wordsmith quote and the polished this, that, and the other thing from the CEOs and the rest, it diminishes the credibility of the publication and therefore makes it a crappier platform for when things actually are lauded.
I think I remember when I was writing for the trade magazines, when I was coming up in this world, one of the magazines had, and I ended up becoming its editor, was based in Geneva, and it was called Couture International Jeweler. I also do jewelry writing. It was sister publication to Europa Star, which you might know, or many readers,
of course,
listeners might know. And I think I remember kind of learning that there was a difference in some way between the way that European magazines or European publications handled pay for play, that there was more of an explicit understanding that if they're an advertiser, we're definitely going to include them. We're definitely going to feature them in some way. And I remember that sort of disturbing me, concerning me, making me uncomfortable. But it was just, the magazine I worked for and the world I was in. I had this idea then that maybe Europe was different than America. I always sort of championed the way the American media worked, which in my understanding was always, again, the New York Times, the LA Times, what I learned at the Daily Bruin way back when. This is all objective, or meant to be as objective as possible. When I wrote this piece for Robb Report, I think I even mentioned that, European brands come from this world where they're used to having publications kowtow to them or somehow just, sort of defer to them in the pieces they write. And somebody called me out. Somebody emailed me and said, actually, I'm German, and we always thought it was the Americans who sort of worked that way. I don't really know what you're talking about when you claim that, European brands or Europeans expect this more. So, I guess that's to be debated. But, I think there is definitely a culture of pay to play that has probably confused a lot of executives, and maybe it's not that they're all, it's not that, I think there's a lot of arrogance on the part of the bigger corporate groups, a lot of arrogance, a lot of assumptions that we're such an, incredible company. I think a lot about probably the biggest luxury group in the world. I won't name it, but I think you all know. And they're
I wonder who that is.
I wonder. Starts with an L, ends with an H. There's an incredible amount of arrogance. They create beautiful products, and they're great, they're great watchmakers, great designers, great marketers. And I think they just assume that what they say goes. It's very confusing to me. One of your questions was about access journalism. And I think the fear that if you upset one of these bigger groups, they'll come back at you and say, well, then you're not going to be invited to our events anymore. I've never had that happen. I've never had that kind of confrontation with a brand. If they said that to me, I'd just be like, you're lost. Then I won't write about you for the Times,
Well, but that's it. You have a extreme position of privilege in the landscape of watch media, in that you do write for the New York Times and Robb Report, among others. And I think that protects you. For people who are creating content that is not, so I think one of the key differences between what you do and what a lot of people who are creating content in the watch media space is that your audience is like real people, the real world. It's not watch enthusiasts.
Exactly.
You are writing for, my parents read your work in the New York Times, right? Like, they live in New York City. They subscribe to the New York Times. It literally gets delivered on a daily basis. They read your work. That's how they understand the watch industry, because they're like normal people who have a life. And, if the New York Times reports on watches, they'll Asher's shaking his head. Yeah. Okay. They're somewhat normal people who kind of have a life, but they're like they're civilians. Right. In the world of watch media, and Stephen Pulverant was the one who brought this up. It's a much more commoditized space where, you've got Hodinkee and Worn and Wound and Fratello and SJ, and the list goes on. And that's not even mentioning who the major content creators are who have Substacks or YouTube channels or whatever. And so it is much more possible for a watch outlet to freeze out an individual, a watch brand to freeze out an individual writer or a publication. And I've seen it happen. And I've also seen the opposite. Asher was like, well, maybe we should give the fellow who pitched you and wanted to collaborate the benefit of the doubt. But absolutely not. The people we cannot give the benefit of the doubt are the PR professionals.
Yeah.
These are people who, like you, like us, have decades long careers, who should know better, who know the difference between the New York Times and a YouTuber. Yet they demonstrate this kind of behavior. And I do think that and maybe not in Germany, which is a very idiosyncratic country, but I have seen that there is much more of a prevalence of this pay to play attitude with the Swiss, and when we work with the Swiss, and I've seen two things happen, and this was from the same PR professional in Switzerland. We worked on a project a couple of years ago. Yeah, Asher knows what this is. We worked on a project a couple of years ago where a content creator decided to we pitched, and this content creator created some content for a launch we were doing with another brand, a collaborative watch. And the PR professional at that brand insisted that they needed to review everything before it was published. And it's like, no. But they fell back on, we want to, we are a highly technical brand and we want to ensure the information is accurate. But they were more interested in how the quote of their CEO came off than anything that was like technical about a watch or anything like that. Now, the same PR professional, in a different conversation we were having, in transparency, when we do collaborative watches, and it's often Asher who plays the role of the PR person at Collective, like we pitch watch media to cover what we create, and we'll often divide that up with the brand based on who has a relationship with which outlet. So we may say, hey, for this given watch launch, we're going to pitch these 5 outlets. We have a good relationship with them, and the PR person at the watch brand will say, we're going to pitch these 5 because we have a good relationship with them. Great. That works awesome. One of the conversations we had with this PR person when we were deciding who is going to pitch which media outlet evolved into them saying, we're going to pitch this particular media outlet because we have a paid relationship with them. We have a package where they've agreed that they're going to cover X amount of stories for us this year. And so we'll just include this as part of that. You can thank us later, guys. And so for me, though, this was very clarifying as to why that person felt entitled to review the content from a third party, is because they have this mindset of like, well, either we'll give them the benefit of the doubt that the lines are blurred and they forget what's paid for and what's not, or they have a mindset of like, we hold the leverage. I want to go to a little bit of a conspiracy theory I have that I got from Ariel Adams, and I know you've been on his podcast, and he talks about this quite a bit.
Yeah.
Which is one of the fundamental challenges in watch media is that the brands, and this is painting with a broad brush, do not like to pay for advertising. And what they do instead is they hold back their advertising dollars and they use it instead for advertorial content, pay-to-play journalism as a form of leverage. And because they're unwilling just to write a check or to buy effective advertising from watch media, what instead happens is pay-to-play becomes the currency of watch media. And I wonder if, and Asher, I don't know if you have a perspective on this as well, but I wonder if, the advertising realities of most watch media, and we can separate out Robb Report and New York Times, who seem to have a very robust advertising business in this space.
Right.
I wonder if that's creating part of the problem. And I guess my conspiracy theory question is that a bug, or is that actually a feature? Are these brands sitting on that money so that they can use it as greater leverage?
I'll give you my opinion, and Victoria, I'd love yours too. I think the fundamental problem is that the advertising doesn't work. And because the advertising doesn't work, there is a push to look at what they, and they being brands feel like will be more effective, which is the media. And part of that is like a broader misunderstanding of the modern landscape of advertising. We've talked about this in the past, and we've even run the numbers on the challenges for watch media. But the bottom line is like interstitial video and like display advertising. Like these are archaic and old school methods of advertising that also are not designed for, not to get like advertising nerdy here, but are like not designed for the objective that the client wants. Nobody is going to be like, oh, wow, what a cool watch. Click on banner. Here's $50,000. Like, that's just not a conversion that happens.
I would disagree, dude.
Well, no, let me finish the thought, though.
We use display advertising all the time on Google and Meta, and we get actionable reporting that
that's not display advertising. That is display. Direct response. And there's a fundamental
it's display. It's using photos and videos.
Well, no, okay. Let me.
I think the challenge.
I think we can split
media, well, hold on a second. I think the challenge with watch media is it's not accountable. It's not that it's display. It's that it's not accountable. So
no, I disagree. I think it's not a matter of accountability. This is important. I think it's a question of what
it is important.
I think it's a question of what the expectation is of the investment. Okay. So, like, for example, if somebody says, okay, I'm an ad executive at Watch Media Outlet X. All right. And Gabe, pile on if you think I'm crazy here. But like, if I'm a account executive and I go to a watch brand and I say, here's a $20,000 media package. Okay. And comprised of that media package are these different types of ad formats, et cetera. What's your goal? 99% of the time, it's not going to be like awareness. It's going to be, I want to sell watches. Okay, great. So their solution, and Gabe, we know this because we've been pitched by some of these outlets, is, okay, we'll have them click to your website. And when you say, cool, what is and this is your point around accountability, like, what is your average conversion rate? What should we expect if we spend $20,000? How much should we expect to make in sales? And they don't know the answer to that. But
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. But the flip side is when you look at articles, like, so a quote unquote pay to play article or a video or like whatever, there is a lot more transparency in terms of direct traffic, in terms of potentially whether that traffic converted. I mean, maybe not direct attribution, but certainly some degree of correlation that's easier to measure. If an article goes live that day, it's the only article, and you suddenly sold 20 watches, you can make a reasonable assumption that article sold the watches. And that's a lot harder to do with advertising, which has more robust analytics, but often those analytics are not being offered in the level of advertising that's being made. So all of this is to say, I think the reason why these brands do it is because they don't think the advertising works. And if they don't think the advertising works, then they don't want to pay for it.
You're right. And I guess what I'm saying is I think part of the responsibility of the advertising not working is it sits at the feet of Watch Media itself, because you and I have been in meetings with Watch Media where they have pitched us on advertising packages, exactly what you're describing. And when you, Asher, say to them, okay, and what are the metrics that you're going to use to evaluate the success of this? They look at you like you have four heads and you should just be buying their bundle of banner ads. So I don't think it's the banner ads.
I have four eyes, not four heads.
Well, sure. But I don't think it's the banner ads themselves. I think it's just the lack of accountability. And so I think that's what is creating the problem here.
Fine.
So
I'll back off the IAB standard units. I'm just, I guess my you're putting your finger on it, and I guess this goes back to you, Victoria, while you watched this cage match here. Is
let's carry on.
But this actually goes to something that I really want your point of view on, because we touched on it, and I think it sort of dovetails on this, which is the rise of Substack and how it sits in journalism. Because on the one hand, Substack is actually showing in some ways something that I think is really exciting. This idea that for certain journalists, people are willing to pay for content. And if they are willing to pay for it, that relieves some degree of third-party pressure because they aren't reliant on the ad package or the sponsored video or whatever. But here's my question for you as a journalist about it, because I wonder, there's one Substack that we subscribe to, which is phenomenally well written, if not strongly opinionated, but he gets facts wrong sometimes. And sometimes those facts are material, even if the overarching idea is sound or like the thesis is right. So my question for you is, like, when you had to pick between two evils here, subsidized content under the dominion of, luxury company PR, or someone whose best intent is there, but the data's not right.
Yeah.
Where would you, like, what poll do you gravitate towards? And what would you suggest as what's a North Star that we can use there for creators or writers?
I would actually just advocate consuming all of it, and sort of taking the good with the bad. I don't know that one is necessarily better than another, because facts matter. And if we don't value them, then, it's just, we
I
spiral
will
out of
add that I
control.
don't think it's intentional misrepresentation of facts for the Substack person. It's just a
Of
mistake
course.
versus a pay for play where it might be intentional.
Right. I mean, I guess if you trust this Substack writer and you feel like the general sort of upshot you're getting from these articles or whatever he's writing is valuable or worthwhile or insightful, I guess I would gravitate there if you force me to. But I think taking it all into account is helpful. I mean, I guess that's the problem. I mean, I've thought to myself, if I ever lost my job, if ever my editor at the Times said, "You're compromised and we can't work with you anymore." And I am compromised. I'm not a totally uncompromised writer. So I'm not this paragon of journalistic integrity, I don't think. And if she ever said to me, "We're done," I think I'd probably have to start a Substack. I don't know how else I'd make up that income. But I would worry that the standards, my own standards aren't as high as the Times. Maybe I'm willing to cut corners when I'm busy. Maybe I'm willing to sort of take an emailed response when, if this were for the Times and I knew my editor was going to look badly on that, I wouldn't. So I do think you have to take all that with a grain of salt. Somebody's trying to make a living and they'll do what they need to do. And maybe that means cutting some journalistic corners. But I guess you just get you develop your, whatever it is you need to know about that watchmaker or this product or the general trend of the business by consuming as much as you can. I mean, you don't rely on one person for anything, right?
Mm.
I mean, we don't do that. We don't just have one person be our North Star and don't listen or take in any other information. We take in as much as we possibly can and try to sort of sift through it. I guess that's how that's how I do it. I don't really, there's not a single person. I mean, I use a lot of other sites and I check a lot of stuff through, any of these blogs that, or content platforms that we've mentioned, Hodinkee, SJX, whatever, Fratello. I often will call up those editors and just include them. I mean, I often interview other journalists who are, more watch people. I consider myself, to Gabe's point earlier, a generalist who happens to kind of write about watches, or I write for an audience of people who don't particularly know about watches, and I try to make watches interesting enough for them to carry on with, the read. But somebody at like Fratello, like Robert, RJ, I'll call him and interview him when I can. I think we all have our place in this universe, and if you're really intent on studying and becoming a student of the watch business, you just try to, sort of take it all in as best you can.
I think some of the things you just laid out underscore something important for people to consider, which is, I don't know, and I'll just speak from my own bias and what I'm guilty of. Like, I tend to take what I read in, say, the New York Times from your reporting or the reporting that others do about watches, kind of with the same weight as I do what I might read in Fratello or Hodinkee or whatever. That's not to throw any shade on those folks. Everyone has a role in this ecosystem, which is what you're saying, and has different strengths. Yep. But more specifically, like, what are the actual things that you're doing differently? Because I think, look, the New York Times is a great example. It is an august and robust institution. And behind you, Victoria, in your reporting, I'm sure are an army of people who are doing things like copy editing and fact checking. You have an editor who needs to review this stuff. I'm sure the New York Times for you might even literally be a manual or a book of like editorial standards to which you're held to account, which other folks don't have. So when someone reads your writing, and let's use the New York Times as the example, in the New York Times about watches, what are you doing differently in the way you report and you write than maybe done differently elsewhere?
Well, I'll give you a recent example of what I'm doing differently and what I'm not doing differently. And it's from the jewelry world, but it applies. So I cover jewelry, maybe a little less than watches, but I've always been a real 50-50 jewelry watch writer. And in October, I went on a jewelry trip. And I do take jewelry trips or press trips for watches, for jewelry. I'm not supposed to. And if my editors are listening to this, we will have a very serious conversation, and, who knows where that leads. I don't write about trips. Like years ago, I went to St. Bart's with Richard Mille. This was like 15 years ago for a sailing event. And just, I couldn't write about it. I'm not, certainly not for the Times. I mean, maybe for like an editor's letter for JCK, I could have woven that in somehow. And so I make clear to the brand, I'm happy to go on this trip. Thank you for inviting me. I'm honored. I can't write about the trip, but if you look at this as a relationship building, experience where I get to know the brand better down the line at some point, I'm sure I'll write about Richard Mille in a way that feels relevant to what I'm doing. So I make that clear up front that I can't write about this trip or that particular product or this event. Last night I went to a dinner for a jewelry brand that was celebrating its 25th anniversary. And I get an email from the PR in advance saying, well, we look forward to hearing about your coverage. And I get there and everybody's like, well, what are you writing? I'm like, I can't write about this dinner. Maybe down the line, when I write a story about gold jewelry, I'll call the designer and say, tell me about the price of gold and how it's affecting you. And that's how I'll sort of repay that debt, as it were. So I try to make clear that I won't pay for play in that way. And if they want to, I've literally said to people, if you want to rescind that invitation, it's okay. I get it. I'm not going to do the thing that all the other writers said they would, but I still take the trips because otherwise I found that my stories really suffer when I'm not in person, or when I get a lot of ideas when I'm out in the world with people, whether it's just talking to the journalist next to me at the dinner table or overhearing something the executive said kind of in passing. I get a lot of ideas that way. And if I weren't out on these excursions that brands pay for and they fly me business class for, then I wouldn't get them. So I have to make that decision. And that's when I said I was compromised, that's mostly what I meant. But I'll give you an example just to go back to this example I cited. So I was on this trip in Venice. It was for a jewelry brand owned by Roberto Coin. I'll just come out and say it. And he's a Venetian. His company's based in nearby Vicenza in the Veneto region. And we were getting a tour. We were there to celebrate the fact that he was throwing a big party. It was actually a masquerade ball. So he literally paid for all these journalists to come over, threw a giant masquerade ball, and then took us to his factory as just a sort of a side excursion because we were already there. And we were at his factory. They passed around a gold bar, like kilo of gold that at the time today it's probably at least $120,000 worth of gold. Then it was like 90,000 because maybe the price of gold was like 2,500 an ounce. And I was working at that time on a story that was due like in a few weeks for the Times about how gold, the price of gold and the ascending price of gold was impacting jewelry. And this example of like me holding this gold bar, then passing it around, it was so just such a visual, such an image that when I wrote the story, I quoted the manager of the factory talking about the price of gold. And as he passed around this gold bar, he said in Vicenza at his factory. And that's the thing about the Times is my editor always asks, where was this person? How did you interview them? And where were they? And were they there? What reason were they doing? So if I interview somebody who's in London, but isn't living in London, she needs to know, is he there on business? Is he there on pleasure? I mean, they get really granular. And so I didn't lie. I sort of put it out there and just thought, maybe she won't ask. Maybe she won't ask why I was in Venice. Maybe she won't ask. And then lo and behold, she asked. She said, I have to ask, in her notes to me when she came back with the story, were you there on a sponsored trip? And I can't remember where I was when I got that email. I think I was on another press trip, actually. And I happened to be with two other editors who both write for the same editor at the Times. They're both London-based. And I put them aside and I said, listen, she came back to me with this question, like, how would you answer? Should I lie? Should I tell her I wasn't on a sponsored trip? I just happened to be there. And they were both like, no, don't lie. This relationship with your editor is so important. If she figures out in some way, I mean, I didn't really think she could figure out that I was lying, but I was like, yeah, of course, I shouldn't lie to my editors. So I came back to her and I said, I was there on a sponsored trip. It was for JCK. I was there covering it for this other outlet. It was just such a good visual. I couldn't resist. And she's like, well, we just need to take it out. We need to take out that part. You can't quote them. And presumably I probably can't quote them for years from now because I've been on this trip with them and she knows it. It's a long, long way of saying the Times takes that shit so seriously. Like if she knew I was on a trip, that brand comes right out of the article. I mean, I had to go back to the brand and say, I'm sorry, I had to take it out.
Just for a point of clarification, like why is that? I mean, the quote happened. You were actually there. It was. Is it because that the context around it means that it's somehow compromised? Like what's the theory of why you can't report that?
Because there's a conflict of interest. They've flown me out. I've been paid. I've been, presumably put up in a nice hotel. As I said, I was invited to a masquerade ball. I'm obviously sort of inclined to favor this brand, and the Times is allergic to anything of the sort. And I admire that. It was a good reminder of why the Times can be counted on to. I mean, not that I don't make mistakes, and not that. Again, I'm not the purist. I mean, I was at a recent event where another writer there declined to take the gift bag home. Everybody had a gift bag at their seat. And she's like, no, thanks. I don't accept gifts. And I was like, oh my God, like I wish I had the discipline to say no thanks to whatever was in there, Well, I know what was in there and I didn't have the discipline. I'm not, again, the paragon of journalistic integrity. I think a lot of people that I maybe had gone to school with who I write with, I worked when I was at the Daily Bruin, my editor in chief at the time, she's now at the New York Times. She was at the Washington Post. I'm sure she doesn't consider me to be like her, like we are not the same. She's a real investigative journalist. I am not. I am compromised, but I still have my standards, and I do try my very best not to sort of like, I guess not to say anything that feels dishonest, but I mean, I struggle with this. It's not that it's easy. I struggle with how to be in this world and how to have integrity and yet at the same time take advantage of these opportunities.
As we wrap this up, I'm struck by a couple of things. And one is, as is so often true, there's a lot of keyboard warriors that will proclaim the desire for journalistic integrity and objective reporting. And you're making a very valid point that I think is critical here. You, who have been doing this for decades, who work for some of the finest and most established news organizations in the world, recognize in yourself some areas that even for you feel maybe I could do better. And I don't mean that as anything as judgment. That's self-awareness, and self-awareness is frankly a lot harder than any take it from me. Self-awareness is a tough thing to fight with. But it's not a simple path. And conversely, for those that operate in a world where their paychecks are made by the brands that put money in their pocket, the question isn't, to me at least, the question isn't, is that ethical? The question is, are you presenting that information in an ethical way? Because of course it's ethical to be paid by someone to make something. That's a job. What's unethical, right? I mean, like what's unethical is when it's misrepresented. And right. What started this whole conversation, your open letter, is because those two things were were in complete opposition. The integrity that you present as a reporter was being met full force by someone who thought that they were hiring you for a job. Right. And like those two things like don't jive. And so I just, as I step back and I look at this and I think, okay, well, what's the takeaway here? To me, it's what you said a couple of minutes ago, that if you want a full picture, you got to look at everything and make your own assessment. There is no one thing that's going to tell you the truth. And I'll leave it with one last anecdote. I took a semester studying in London when I was in college, and I stayed in a flat, and the guy below me in the flat was this old English guy. And every day I'd see him sitting out in the garden, and he would have in front of him The Guardian, the London Times, and then some like Metro, like some, like tube rag. And he read them all cover to cover. And I asked him, like, well, what's the deal? And he was like, well, the Times is conservative and the Guardian is liberal and the Metro is mostly trash. But if I average it all together, I got a pretty good idea of what's actually happening. And
exactly.
So I now I don't have the time to do that. And that guy was awesome. And he was probably retired. but
Right.
but I do take that away from what you're saying. And it's a valid point. Like there is no one size fits all guarantee of truth in that, at least from what you're describing.
No, I mean, yeah, obviously it depends on what your goals are and what you're looking for. If you're just looking for somebody's on the wrist review of which watch wore better, yeah, there's plenty of that, You don't need to read my stories to get to that, that answer or the thing you're looking for, which is just guidance on if this is the model for you or that model. So it really depends. I mean, I serve a much different kind of audience than I think a lot of maybe or who knows, I mean, I'm sure the listeners here have competing interests, interest in the business at large, interest in products. So yeah, there's a wide array of content out there for them. And I hope that I, shed light on certain things that maybe they find interesting, but in no way do I represent, the one that you should be reading above all else at all. I'm just one of many, and I appreciate that. And I'm happy to be in like a flourishing industry that is certainly bigger than it was 25 years ago when I started. It's massive. It's incredible.
Well, I think most importantly to us, you are the one who spoke out with an open letter. And there isn't a lot of, we can say about it what we will, but for all the reasons we discussed, there just isn't a lot of speaking up and speaking out in the watch industry, particularly among watch media. And for that, we're really grateful because you are, whether or not we have all the answers, you are raising and putting your finger on a real issue that needs sunlight. And we're glad that you did that. And we're grateful that you were here to chat about that with us. So Victoria, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you guys so much. Gabe, Asher, always a pleasure. You noted June 7th for the event. I'm going to put that in my calendar as soon as we get off this. I'm sure I'll see you there.
There will be no gift bag for you.
No gift bags.
No
okay.
gift bags.
I'm gonna try to get through it.
Everyone else will get a gift bag, just not you. We're starting today.
To be clear, there are no gift bags, period, Gabe.
There are no gift bags.
But there are drinks.
There is an open bar. Well, thanks so much for listening. This, of course, is Open Work, a production of Collective Horology. You can find us and learn about our open house event at collectivehorology.com. And you can learn more about our guest, Victoria Gomelsky, at victoriagomelsky.com. And you can find her writing at JCK, the New York Times, and Robb Report. To get in touch with feedback, questions, suggestions, or all of our sponsorship opportunities, I'm just kidding, email podcast@collectivehorology.com.